This show is part of the Darkmoor Podcast Network.
To join our community Discord or see more content from our members, visit darkmoorpodcasts.com.
In today's episode, we discuss mythology and mythos, collective world building, and becoming the grand architect of the sessions at your table. This is the DM Shower Thoughts. Welcome back. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to today's episode of the DM Shower Thoughts, the show where we talk about our shower thoughts in 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons and tabletop scenarios in general, how to become your best self through gaming. My name is Adamus.
I'm John.
And I'm Ian.
So, Ian and I were able to jump back into our buddies over at the Darkmoor Podcast Network through the Misadventurers. And we worked with their DM, Jim, to explore their mythical folklore tour, which is often the setting of the Misadventurers, which is really cool. So he does a lot of myth research. And when we did our Switch episode with him, which was by now has come out, we went through basically it. You should listen to it, but it's like Jurassic Park, but with mythic creatures and mythology, like very structured mythology. And when you're in the middle of the adventure, you don't always get the chance to talk about it. So we got a chance to jump on to an analysis episode, which he dubs the Myth Adventurers. We're very punny over there. And that was really cool because we got to really explore, okay, what were the mythologies, what were the stories, and the major theological questions and ideals and whatnot of these things that were in this park that we walked through and went, well, that's a glimpse of something. I wonder what that is. And we kept going. Whereas now we get to discuss those little parts. And it brought out a really interesting discussion. And that has now made me think a lot more about world building. When you have the influences in mythology, ideals, and society, and what that reveals about what the community values and what they fear, and how that pertains to our own world. I'm just going to use a very quick example of the Japanese folklore, specifically the yokai. And the yokai are spirits. It's a general term of a whole bunch of spirits. And the spirits are often mischievous. They can be watching the cat, sorry. They can be mischievous, they can be malevolent, they can be neutral, but they all have like rules and have different ways of dealing with them. And it brought about an interesting discussion about the people in the Japanese culture. If they are able to navigate the spirits, the yokai, and how they interact with the world with grace and poise, then they will live a full life. That they will fulfill their community and they will fulfill their lives because they won't be messed with by the spirits. And we talked about how there's explanations of why did this happen? Why did this person fall off the bridge? Well, they were dragged into the water by a kappa, and it's because they insulted the kappa or they weren't polite to the kappa, and that's why they drowned. And this, those fears that come out, instead of just everything's random, there's a reason for everything, and the yokai influence that. But when I think about this, when we talk about world building, when we first initially have our tavern keep or our people moving around a small town, often what we run into are the players ask the NPCs, hey, how do I find a shield? Hey, I need a mission. Hey, I need a job. And we give them these more concrete examples of things. We might have a colorful character that they interact with. We might have someone who's a little off kilter. And then we start to move away from the NPC gives you the direct information to the NPC gives you a story. The NPC gives you a tale. The NPC gives you observations. They give you a contact that might have someone else to give you more information or to give you a story to move through. And that realizing that these people, these creatures, and these societies in your worlds will also have their own myths and stories. and those stories and myths may reveal their values. And I say it like that because the yokai and many of their interactions support the idea of community and politeness in Japan. So a lot of yokai became that way because they were neglected. You didn't take care of your stuff, or you threw away something that you should have recycled. And like the kappa. The kappa is this weird turtle creature that has a strange bushy hair around a sara, which is an indentation in its head where water is like fills. And they love wrestling, and they're obsessed with politeness. And the whole idea is you can go up to a kappa and bow to it, and it must bow back because you're polite. And then the water pours out of its head, and it becomes weakened, and it can't fight you. However, if you then refill the water, which is a kind thing to do, it now dedicates itself to you as a friend for life. Whereas other stories of kappa, when you are not polite to them, they rip you to pieces. They drag you under the water. They beat you senseless and then drown you. It's terrible. But if you just bow to them, it's all okay. And that supports this ideal of politeness, always politeness. And these little stories of how the hero defeated it, they were just a good person, and they bowed to it. They were respectful. And then what does that do to think about naming conventions in a city and naming conventions in our various worlds? The more I build out the Feywild and the Shadowfell, how much more depth can you provide something instead of saying it's the Dark Forest, and instead named it your Thornseal, the Forest of Vehemence, which is different. There's a different story there by using that different naming conventions where we get a little bit deeper in our naming conventions. It's different than Senaliesa, the Dark Forest, or Senaliesa, the Tomb of Night. There's something else there that has a little bit more depth. And as we move through that, that's interesting to think about. If you added layers to your names and then to the stories, if it's called that, what does the populace talk about it? Because none of these creatures exist, none of these places exist in vacuums. There are peoples and creatures and stories and governments and whatnot that are all interacting with these things. And it's kind of neat to note, well, what do the townsfolk know about this? And what does the expert know about this? And how can we disseminate that information to the players if they are interested in finding that out? How much more depth does that give your world? Plus, if there are stories circulating about a thing, does that affect the kids? Does that affect the random guy in the street? And does that affect the professor who lives in the high tower? And what does that do to even adjust the structure in your sessions to make it go somewhere? John, you had something?
Yeah, so this reminds me of a video that WebDM did. I can't remember how long ago, but they were basically talking about building pantheons. And a lot of times when we approach pantheon building in D&D, there is a modern sensibility to it in that you think of like the major things that you want covered and you assign a god or goddess to that major thing, right? So you might think of it in terms of cleric domains. So who is going to be our sun god? Who's going to be our ocean god, And it's like this very perfectly balanced, clean, there's a category for everyone. Whereas in a lot of medieval communities, it would be more like what you're saying, Adam, where it was very highly specific, value-based creatures that would tell you about the values of that community and also some of the problems that the community might have too. Like, I remember one of the things Jim from WebDM talked about is like, there was a community where there was a sewer spirit, and if there was something wrong with the sewage system of the community, it was because somebody upset the spirit of that thing. So there are these highly specific creatures that play a functional role in the community, whether it's from the abstract or the concrete. So a lot of times, some of the like the Kappa, there is the abstract, like philosophical value side of politeness, but then there's the concrete side of you don't want to drown, and if we don't know what caused this person to drown, what could it have been? And you get these very very powerful stories that end up getting told. And it's why when I was designing my latest campaign setting of Geras, I actually foregoed a I don't know if foregoed is the way
Foregone?
to say it. Foregone.
Forgot.
Just
Yeah,
remember, I studied language.
Or went, I think.
Forwent.
Yeah,
Forwent.
because in Swedish they use forwent if you translate it. So I don't know if that's a
I
word
didn't
in
do it.
English.
That's what we did. Using my English brain.
You
I did.
chose
So-
to forego it. You
chose to forego.
Chose to
There we
forego.
go.
Yeah, there you
I chose to forego a pantheon, or like any sort of overarching religious system, because I was more interested in exploring the difference between superstitious communities and scientifically minded communities. And like another game system that does this really, really well is the Witcher pen and paper RPG, where, for those of us that know The Witcher, whether from the Netflix show or the video games, the Witchers are highly trained monster hunters that have a very scientific approach to their monster hunting, right? So it's like, this creature, most people will think of this creature as like a fisherman who's died in shallow water. But Witchers know that these are actually alien entities that were accidentally brought here when the dimensions of the world accidentally converged, So there's almost like two sets of knowledge. There's the common folklore, like the mythology side of it, and then there's the Witcher knowledge. And trained Witchers have to understand both, because the only way they can figure out what they're fighting to apply a scientific solution to it is by understanding how common folk talk about it and talk about that mythology. So the thing that you brought up, Adam, that I thought was brilliant is this assumption that the NPCs are being truthful. And I don't mean truthful as in they're being dishonest, but they don't have the whole story, So if you talk to a Cavern Keep and they're like, oh yeah, they were drowned by the Kappa, and you're like, well, in this region of the world, there are no Kappas, which might mean that something caused them to drown, but it may not exactly be this creature that they think it is. So let's go investigate the scene. It's a clue, not the whole thing.
Yeah.
And how excited, and this was the question I asked in Geras, because of course I love The Witcher, and that was a huge influence, was how do you give the players enough that you give them a hook without giving them the whole story, so you're feeding that appetite of them wanting to pursue more stuff. And this is, again, part of how you leave players feeling more energized than when you started.
Yeah.
You give them that sense of anticipation, but also the sense of agency that they can do something about it. Because the other trap that I've seen DMs fall into is they leave a mystery, but don't give them enough to act on. Or how they can act on it is too vague because they're trying to give players a certain kind of freedom, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's how do you balance giving them enough information that they feel like they can act on it and they have a clear thing that they can go do without being so restrictive that now you're limiting the amount that they're interacting with the game, because if the clearer you make the path, the less choice they might end up having. So it's playing that dance in the moment of giving them enough to work on without restricting them and basically not letting them play the other side of it,
Yeah. There's a lot of details here that I'm finding there's almost like a strange psychological separation in terms of what the characters know and then what the players know. And when you present a mythology or even present the hook in the story, present just a little bit of information, but not the entire thing, there is sometimes I'll have it, and it's so cool when it happens, I'll have it that the players figure it out. That the players go, wait, based on the theming of this story, and wait, based on the parallels here, and wait a second, oh, they thought it was this, and they thought it was that, and the players kind of figure it out, and then as characters, they go forward and figure it out. But then that's so much more energizing and exciting when the players are thinking about it like a puzzle. They're thinking about it like a game. And that's so much more fun than, I don't get it, I'm not sure, I roll to see if I get it. And it's like, we can actually remove ourselves a little bit from the structured game state to present these things as ideas and hooks and try to literally put it together. Think about it literally. And we that actually tied right back into when we played with Jim of the Misadventurers, because we had a moment where we had a interacting with a creature, and they had riddles for us to solve, and they would ask each of us a riddle. And we asked, and one of the players jumped in and went, "So do we like roll to figure this out?" And Jim went, "No, this is you." Like, oh, okay. So we had to kind of, in a way, remove ourselves from the mechanical game state and think critically about the words we're hearing. Okay, say the riddle one more time. Okay, all right. And now we really have to think about it and then solve the riddle. We all did very well. We all solved the riddles. Spoiler alert. But to remove that structure of almost like having a cheat code on, of no, I have to figure this out, was so much more energizing, so much more fun to be able to sit back and go, it was stressful, but really good. I had that moment of, oh, no. Oh, it's this. It's got to be this. Okay, cool. And when we figured something out, we really wanted to help our allies. We're like across the bridge going, wait, we know what it is. Can we do a sleight of hand and show, give them hints or something? And that became a much stronger thing to do rather than I roll to see if I get it right. And that's a very different approach.
So just as like a quick response to that, there are a few things that you just brought up that are like useful to unpack, which is that if your players are saying, I just want to get to the next thing, that means you have not presented them enough information to act on.
Yeah.
And a lot of times DMs value the reveal, like that moment of, whoa! But the danger to trying to do that too often is not giving your players enough to interact with, So it's like if you're in a blank room and there's nothing to do, your DM is your eyes, ears, your nose, your senses, right?
Yeah.
So if your DM if your players are going, I just want to get to the next thing, that means you haven't presented them with enough information that they feel that they can act on. And I've been in I've been the player that's been like, I click A to skip the cutscene. Let's get to the part where I can play. And the other side of it too is like, riddles frustrate the living crap out of me. And the reason for that is, first of all, I don't like them. I'm just bad at them. But sometimes, like that example, that is a player test, not a character test.
Yeah.
So that is you, Adam, is solving the riddle, not your character.
Mm-hmm.
And there are going to be some players that are energized by that, like you said. So part of the song and dance is seeing what lights up your players. If your players are asking, can I just roll for it? That means they're not having fun with it and they just want to get to the next thing. And trying to belabor that point isn't going to add energy to your table,
Right.
So part of it is, and I'm not saying don't do riddles. I'm just saying pay attention to the reception.
Yeah.
I remember Thursdays, everybody, that one session you did riddles, everyone was like really about it. I wasn't really about it, but I wasn't going to ruin everyone else's good times by being a jerk about it. But at the same time, I'm like, I'm just not going to play this part because I don't want to. And that's okay too, to recognize, as long as you're not, being too toxic or at the table or anything like that. But it is good to recognize there are times where in the structure of your session, there are times where you can present your players player challenges, but also recognize that if some players want to play their character, they're going to feel a disconnect and feel less immersed. Some players are going to feel more immersed. It's more just learning to pick up those signs.
And I think I'm sorry to jump in one more time. It is important to recognize that because this was a Switch series, our characters didn't have a lot of built-in depth. It was very much like we were just supplanted. We look like this. Okay, we get our skills and we go. And that makes it so in a lot of ways, we're not really our characters as much as we get to act like them. It's kind of funny. It's kind of interesting that way, but really we're moving through this adventure. And that allows sort of the veil breaks down between the character and the player because we don't have a history We just
Mm.
are at the moment. But I think in another setting, more and more, the more time you spend as a character and as a player in a certain setting and a certain style and with a certain DM, that becomes a lot harder, but maybe a lot clearer.
That is an excellent point to bring up. That is a legitimate play style of my character is an avatar that I interact with the game state through. There isn't a separation in terms of personality or decision-making power between me and my character. You know, that is an excellent point to bring up.
I also wanted to backtrack a little bit to our discussion on mythology, because that is something that I value really highly in my world. I'm not saying that I have a lot of great mythology that is super in depth and there's all sorts of things, because sometimes you just need the bare bones of it to create it along the way. And so there was something here that Adam mentioned about the etymology of certain places or things, creatures even, that their names usually mean something. And we can see that in a lot of different folklore. I am the most knowledgeable about Norse mythology when it comes to me personally. In Norse mythology, you have certain spirits like the Skogsrå, which it means forest spirit or forest vassum. And it is actually this particular one is a woman who has a hollow back, like a tree stump kind of, and she is trying to lure you into the woods to your doom, essentially, so she can kill you. We were talking about the different values that mythology represents of society. In this case, it's don't go in the forest at night. Because there's bears. Everybody knows there's bears. Everybody knows there's wolves. But even worse, there's spirits. Spirits, because what does it mean if you get spirited away by one of these skogsrå? Well, it means that nobody could find your body. So that's probably one of the things that you could take for an example alongside the kappas. People drown in the river. Nobody could find your body. Must have been the kappas, you know. And I really like things like that, because in D&D, you can bring those to life. You can make them actual things. You can make them actual events that happen. I think that by allowing your players to also participate in the creation of your mythology, you are expanding your world even beyond the normal limits of what it could be, because you're just one person. You know, 5 heads are better than one, as it were. And so I think that's one of my favorite things is whenever I'm presenting this mythology to my players, and they have, you know, characters that live in the world and have lived in the world for their whole lives, they must know something too. So why not have them add to it as well? And that's one of the things I enjoy.
To jump right onto that, I find that this is really a great example of organic world building, because I'll present this idea of, like, you have this, you know, this forest that's the forest of vehemence, and then we have people who go, well, what does vehemence mean? And but I might have partially constructed the things that they would interact with. There's a whole bevy of will-o-wisps, and what are will-o-wisps, and where will-o-wisps what are they, and why are they there? And that's the big question that really becomes the problem solving of the party. They could try to navigate this forest and then run into a whole bunch of the willies and have to deal with them. And they could just, you know, kill them all, send them back from whence they came. But if they're agitated spirits, then they'll just come back. And would it be more interesting, especially for this party, if I know that they're of the explorative type and they really want to delve into answering those questions and trying to make the world better in some way? They will go into detail about, well, why did that happen? And what are these, we'll call them willies because it's hard to say the word here, willows, the willows. What are they doing? And what I'll do with this in particular thing is that when they would see the willows, they would but they would defeat them or they get really close to them, they would turn into the face of the spirit that they once were. And then that face has a connection to the lineage of the world. And they would discover a village, and in this village, a ghost town, and there's all these gravestones at the thresholds of all of the buildings. We start to understand that all the willows are the spirits of this town, except all the graves have been desecrated. So now the easy connection there for me is, okay, they just need to fix the gravestones, and then the spirits can be put to rest. But then they started asking other questions. What desecrated it? Would it happen again? And me as the DM, I went, I didn't think about that. But in the moment of that improvisation, and in the moment of the players and the characters giving interest and ideas, we started to formulate, what is this darker entity that maybe has gone through and torn through in this sort of like a calculating, meticulous way to upset all these spirits, to then understand that we've created this bevy of willows. And that created a theming moving forward of, there are these places in the Feywild that are beautiful and wonderful, but have been now corrupted somehow by some other entity that is roaming the landscape. This was intentional, but the players thought of that, and the players helped stoke the fires of that narrative that then drives this forward. And that's what was brilliantly energizing for all of us, where we all like collectively went, could it be that thing that we've been seeing here and there? Could it have done this? And I started planting clues about, oh, you see pine needles. That has always been a running theme for that creature in this place. You see the residue of this, and you get visions of these things when you touch this thing. And it's suddenly we're all together on this story. Whereas this sort of random side encounter of a wrong that was done that can be changed, is now connected to the overarching narrative based upon the input and the interests of the players, which is really cool.
Yeah, you just touched on something which I think is a core part of this conversation, and we're going to talk a little bit in the abstract. But if you think of mythology in the abstract, it is a collective tradition that ends up getting passed down, right? There's not one person that makes all this crap up. It's like there is a community that has contributed over generations to a story that gets more fleshed out and more specific over time. And I think too often what happens more with new DMs, but it can, especially DMs that end up getting set in their ways. Like, to me, I don't care if you've been DMing for 20 years, you could still be a new DM in terms of like, or another way to put it, an amateur DM, versus like the professional mindset, which is something we talk about, which is this idea that the DM should have all the answers, that they should set everything up behind the screen, and the player's job is to uncover the information and ask the right questions for the DM to gift them with the answer. Whereas the style of play I have been finding more and more rewarding from both sides of the screen is where the players have just as much narrative input in terms of world building as the DM does. And it's why Eberron specifically is like my favorite setting so far, because Eberron has very specific events that players can immerse themselves in with enough open-ended questions and with enough blank areas to be filled in that the DM and player can do together. So if you look at Eberron as a world, if you open up, Rising from the Last War, there are maps of all the continents, Corvair is the one that's the most detailed. The other 3 continents are like, these are some stuff we think is happening there. But is it really? We don't know. Nobody goes there. So now as a player and a DM, if you want to explore that place, you can work together. Like maybe a player's like, yeah, I'm from Zendrick. And now as the DM and a player, you got to be like, all right, well, as a DM, I don't know what's going on in Zendrick, so let's figure this out together. Or Arganesson or Sarlona, So, and as a DM, it's where I found my, optimal flow. It let me prep enough where it's like, as players, we're not just gonna spontaneously create everything on the fly. This is very, again, specific details to leverage or to allow you to leverage into immersion, but without it being so closed and so developed that we can't create things spontaneously. So you find that balance of what do you prep ahead of time so that you can make sure you're going to deliver a satisfactory experience, while leaving enough open-ended that even as the DM, like the player, sometimes your players have great ideas and you're like, oh, that's a pretty good idea. And you want to use it. It's like, oh, something desecrated these. Yes, something desecrated these graves. And that's where the powerful storytelling comes from, because the players are contributing as much to as the DM is, and that's how our world's mythologies develop, is because the players had input to what and added to what the DM had prepared ahead of time.
This lends itself as well. I wouldn't say that it's not that a DM should not try and come up with as many details as possible about their world. It's just that there's a different style of play that comes about when you use that tactic. So like I said, I've been, a proponent for allowing my players to essentially affect my world. What do they find in the swamp? What do they find in the caves? What do they know about history that I can add to the lore of the world? But there's also a certain allure, I guess you could say, for me as a DM when I'm world building by myself, which is that I want to have an official history, and I also want to have the true history, or I want to have a known lore and an actual, like, complete comprehensive lore of a certain place. So for me, this speaks to the idea of mysteries that you've had about the past. So if you had a war, who fought the war? What were their goals? But maybe that's not all there is to it. Maybe because, as we all know, history is written by the victors. So just because the party comes across this information that is, official, actual academic knowledge, that doesn't mean that there wasn't more going on. And specifically, I'm actually thinking of how I've developed the Raven Queen and her past in my world of Corsara, which is that I'm opting to use I think it's Volo's Guide or no, Tome of Foes or something like that. The Raven Queen was once immortal, and then she tried to ascend and failed. But there's more history to be uncovered, because the official history doesn't have enough. There's too many gaps. And so what I've been thinking about doing lately is actually just literally coming up with that comprehensive history document of this is what definitely happened in the past. And why to me is that okay? Why is it okay to come up with a full comprehensive idea of something that happened, when in other areas I'm saying you should allow your players to build the world? I think part of it has to do with the fact that they can't change this past because it's happened 2,000 years ago, unless there's time travel involved. Like, maybe there is time travel involved at some point, but then you get multiverse theory. So it's a whole other thing. So just like, it's kind of like what Adam did with IO originally, where there were these events that occurred and there wasn't too much the players could change for these events until we opened it up to multiverse theory. For me, if the event took place in the past and there's no way that the players have, the possibility of time travel, then I might as well create a comprehensive history until they pull out, the deck of many things and all that stuff. So it's something that I think should be defined for any DMs listening out there, that there's nothing wrong with creating comprehensive world building and coming up with all these details. But you shouldn't be averse to allowing your players to change things within the world as you're exploring it with them.
A lot of it comes down to what is energizing about knowledge. Because we said before that one of the scariest things is a blank slate. That it's a blank canvas, okay, go. And the idea of campaigns that are just made up constantly, Like everything is pantsed. Everything is always flying by the seat of your pants. And how those can go pretty off the rails, but and can be really entertaining, I'd say, in short snippets. There's also, or even if they're entertaining in long snippets, you do lose something because there's not as much of a concrete background or even a concrete framework. And that's the big thing, is if we give them not even just rules, just a framework. This is where we start. This is what has happened before. That also grounds some of those creative thoughts. When I work with more and more players that have done more writing in their backgrounds and are really diving deep into narrative structures and all that, they'll understand that this is what happened 2,000 years ago. This is what happened in most recent history, and this is what's happening right now. And there are gaps in that moving forward. And they can fill in those gaps because they're also going to surmise. They're going to identify and figure out what's going on and infer what might be going on. And then we as DMs can take that inference and go, ooh, that's interesting. Would that fit? Yes, no, maybe. And also we could take that inference and go, that's interesting. You're wrong. But let's see what happens when you go down that train and what it can be revealed in that train. And wouldn't it be interesting if we presented clues to both areas and to see, can they critically think about it? Or, oh, that's strange. Why does that not quite line up? But if you have no grounding in what has happened and what could happen and what are the various forces that are in the world, then it's a lot harder to, I think, fill in those gaps because you don't know where the gaps are. So we build those backgrounds and those structures and history to provide opportunities for exploration. Whereas if you have nothing, then yes, you can kind of make it all up in it, and that's a different style, I'd say. There are plenty of tables that I've seen that are highly energized just with that. Oh, we just make everything up, go. And then I've seen highly rewarding tables where they know the background, they know the history, we know moving forward. But then because of that grounding, we can recognize that doesn't make sense because they used to hate each other. What changed? And now a question has been presented in the players and the characters' minds that they can then pursue based upon their background knowledge.
Yeah, and that's actually what's so much fun when you present people, not just players in D&D, but people with a media that creates those kinds of questions. So there's let's take Star Wars, for example. In Star Wars, we have a lot of characters and not enough time to talk to all of them or flesh them out. The director chooses a few of the characters and these are the ones that are focused on the story. We're going to ignore the rest, essentially. And sometimes that can create continuity errors. But there's this interest that is piqued when you show a character in the background and don't say anything about them. So let's just imagine there was this conspiracy about Jar Jar Binks being a Sith from the prequel trilogy, and that's a really funny theory just in general. It's very goofy. You can't even imagine Jar Jar Binks being a Sith. But if you look at the actual movies, there are some things that can't be explained really just by his quirkiness in general, or rather they can be, but you can explain them in other ways too. And this is the classic example of there's 4 people in the tavern. One guy has a hat. There's your guy over there on the other side of the room who you were intending to get this job from. And the players say, I want to talk to the guy in the hat. Because you've given a certain minimal level of detail that allows them to fill in some imaginary backstory or something like that. How did he get that hat? What does the hat look like? If it's a cowboy hat, is it black? Is it matte black? Can I go and talk to him? Does he have a gun on his hip? They're causing ripples in the setting that force you to create different things that you may have intended, but also creating the world around them. They're filling it in because this is, a lot of this is theater of the mind. And even if we're on Roll20, we have these nice backdrops and we have, some nice pictures for the named NPCs, we'll call them. There's always other people milling around. And so I think a skill that you need to have as a DM, not need to have, but a skill that you should work towards, rather, as a DM, is being able to flesh out the surrounding people, not just the named NPCs. And that's something I've actually been trying with Curse of Strahd. In one village, all the people are really gloomy and depressed. In the next village, they're all manically happy. And it's very strange. And that's something that you can use.
When it comes to now the painting the picture of the city, I've been doing a lot more trying to cultivate that skill, where they'll have the people who really stand out. Then I'm trying to figure out, how do I describe the general swath of the paint stroke of what is the general idea of the populace, and what is their general mood, and what is the general swath of races that you might see milling about. And it's been really interesting to try to notice that there are, some cities have tiers, like the workers in one of the Shadowfell cities are all hunched over, plague mask wearing, like weirdo little creatures that pick up things and are scavengers, and they're the lower class, and they're always around, and trying to stress to the players that this is not a ghost town. They're always running around. You just kind of move around them. But then anyone who's not that is automatically more interesting, because they're not the general sight. They're automatically more vibrant. And now you have select NPCs that are different. But how do you make an interesting painting that's still in the background, that gives a basic idea of who's around, how they behave, and what their general mood, I suppose, is, or what they might be up to? And then in creating that, again, background, where are the gaps? Where are the points of vibrancy? Where are the points of interest where players might go, hey, what's that? Now that can be also intentional from the DM's perspective, but then it's so much cooler whenever a player goes, oh, are there any Minotaurs around? And we can decide in that snapshot, are there any Minotaurs around? And if there is, that creates, we just filled in one of those gaps. There's now a Minotaur somewhere. And, well, what are they doing? And now we're answering these questions of this give and take of, what are they wearing? Are they doing this? Are they doing that? And that puts us down a cool little train of, this is why I have like floating story hooks. Every now and then I'll have floating details now. Is this an appropriate time where an NPC that might be slightly connected to someone's backstory or someone's future endeavors, or they might be connected, but the player doesn't know yet that they're connected? Is this a time that we can introduce that? Or is this a time just to make up somebody and see what happens and see where we go in this little train? And so I've said before, I have floating plot hooks, but now I have plot details that are always kind of in the ether, and with more and more characters that are connected to factions and past spider connections. I should not show you my plot board, which is full of red strings linked to all these people. But it is really cool to then see, well, all these peripheral NPCs could show up. And if someone is providing interest, maybe this is a point where I can just take you and put you right there in this gap, in this hole, where a character is giving such intense interest and asking such great questions. Almost as a reward for that, let's raise that up. All these questions are appropriate. These are appropriate things to jump into. Let's give them that connection. It could go somewhere or it could not, and we'll see where it goes.
Something that what we're talking about is something that has been tried to be resolved, I guess you could say. People have tried to make this kind of thing easier by having randomly generated tables for NPCs. and plot hooks, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, the DMG, itself has, create your own adventure by rolling on this table. These tables, basically. What does your BBEG look like? Your big bad evil guy. What is the setting overall? Is it rainy all the time, et cetera? So I just think it's interesting that we're touching on something that people have tried to facilitate through these tables of a roll of the die, because a lot of people, that's what they appreciate about D&D, is that the dice have a major impact in the game. So why not have it make a major impact in the story too, like the actual story, the overall story, the red thread. And I just thought I'd mention that is one way to resolve it. Another way is just to have your players butt in and say, "Who's that guy?" and I think both are entirely acceptable and definitely not mutually exclusive. Like, if you don't know anything about this NPC, feel free to roll on the traits table to figure out what the heck they're like, because I know from my experience that I tend to play NPCs the way I play myself in real life, and that's you want to like branch out a little bit more sometimes.
Ian, you asked one of the most profound questions that comes to D&D and creating an experience and really getting the most out of the game, which is, again, how do you leave players with more energy than they came to the table with? A component of this that doesn't get talked about a lot, or in fact, the discussion of which gets discouraged by, in my opinion, too many people, is the structure of your game, going so far as to be transparent with the game mechanics. And what I mean by that is, this cycles back to, I think it was an article by Roger Ebert. And if anybody is like way more educated about this and wants to call me out on being ignorant, you feel free. But so Roger Ebert had this really famous opinion that video games could not be art. And the reason for that is because they could not transcend their structural medium. So whereas a film, you could immerse yourself into the film because editing techniques and stage design could hide the structural aspects of its production behind techniques. Like, unless you're breaking the fourth wall, you don't see like all the boom mics, that are picking up the sound, or you don't see the editing process. Because that's hidden away, you can immerse yourself into the piece of art, right? Whereas with video games, you usually always have a heads-up display. When you're playing The Witcher and dialogue trees pop up, you see the words that are getting selected that is non-diegetic to the world. It's not like if we're literally thinking of what's happening in the story world, like we're thinking about our choices and the two word bubbles pop up to select, His argument was that because video games by their nature could not ignore that aspect of how to interact or immerse yourself with them, that somehow precluded them from being considered art. Now he's wrong. I'm not even gonna say that as if it's an opinion. Like, we have seen how video games are art, and in fact, if you look up, I can't remember what it is. I think it's Understanding Comics by Scott McCloud. He will argue on what art means in the human experience and why. In fact, I think it's necessary for human evolution or whatever. But that's a whole different side conversation. The idea here is, a lot of times, for the sake of immersion, DMs will a lot of times try to hide the structure of their session. Whereas I think if you make it transparent, it actually lends itself to immersion, because you can process the mechanics faster, which means now you have more freed RAM, basically, to immerse yourself in the world. So instead of being like, don't worry about the mechanics, just describe what you want to do. Now to certain players, you're going to make them slow down because they're going to try to figure out how to meld the mechanics with the story thing, instead of letting the mechanics get out of the way and then dive right into it, And when I talk about the structure of a session, I mean, there are hard parameters that you can adjust to get the most energy out of your table, which includes how much time you're investing in the game, what style of game that you've had, when you choose to end your session. I actually think that if you try to go too long or you cut it too short, that is going to impact the amount of energy you leave your players with. And Ian, you had mentioned, I had mentioned to you Friday night, like the way you ended that session was perfect, because to me, the ideal time to end a session is when the chapter is closed, when you've closed the information loop. That's not necessarily going to work every time. We've talked about how, like, if someone has an emergency and have to leave the session early, we might have to cut it a little bit early. But there is a time where, and Adam was talking about this in Gray Owls with the energetic arc, where you know if you're going to go past midnight, everyone's going to get weird. So, so how do you time out and structure the amount of information you're giving so you're ending the chapter, right? And I think if you're trying to think of your campaign as a long arc of like, it's just continual play until we stop and pause, like you're going to be a little less efficient in cultivating that energy through play, as opposed to giving it a neat end cap where all of a sudden you're leaving everybody on a high and letting them anticipate when the session's going to get picked up next time.
So there are some huge old guard reasonings behind why mechanics were always discouraged at the table, and it had to do a lot with, unfortunately, the relationship, the antagonistic relationship between DMs and players. So it became, how dare you question me, and just take it for what it is, otherwise rocks fall, everyone dies. And let's tell a good story. Whereas the more that we break down these walls, and we run into those weird gray areas in the middle of it too, where we start to reveal the mechanics, and then you have players argue against you about those mechanics. So like, that's not how it says in the book, and that's not the, and then, but that's all coming from experiences that they had to justify their actions. Every single thing. I use this as a bonus action, and I use this as my action, and then I do this because this is what it says in the book. And it's always coming from this weird defensive space of, this is why it works, right? Because you can't argue it. This is why it works. And that's all coming from the old guard. That is coming from the old tables where people only told the story as a narrative space. All the rules were done behind the screen. Any rolls that we did were behind the screen, and people would fudge them and whatever. But it's like the DM says it, the DM is God, and therefore the players now react. And it's that relationship that we're finding that is breaking down. And what we're finding out is there's a great amount of intense and powerful value to revealing the mechanics in play. It's really cool to be able to just like take away the screen and roll live in front of the players. That's a great first step in that, by the way, all you listening DMs. It's nerve-wracking the first time because you're like, oh, what if my monster fails? Oh no. But that's also part of the variables of the game. If the players can do it, it's kind of cool if you do it too. You can also lean back into, this happens narratively. This plays out this way. How do you react? But you can also put them in those terms. And when we reveal the game state in this kind of open space for the players, what does this then give them? And we have to remember, we said it before, we're always teaching. The people at our table, when we play together, there are people at that table that want to be DMs and may not know that right away. They might be playing as players and go, I really want to do this. And we are doing a disservice to them if we're teaching them instead that what I say goes and that's it, and you don't get to know the mechanics because there's no reason for that. Wouldn't it be better if we all were aware of the mechanics? And I said, hey, this is sort of a circumstantial ruling. We're going to kind of stretch the bounds of what's written in the book, and this is how I'm choosing to rule it, and this is why. Let's play through that. And that also gives a great example for anyone who is learning to DM or is DMing also, and on other tables. This is an example of how we could do it. agree or disagree. We can analyze it later. Cool. But it's all out in the open that we as a table bring out the game state. It's not a secret. None of this has to be a secret. And how much more valuable is our table? How much more enjoyable and energizing is our table if everything is out in the open? And I say everything in the sense of the game state and the game structure. That's why when I started, I had not misgivings, but a hesitancy to reveal an act structure in my games. And then I bit the bullet and did it anyway, and that elevated the experience tremendously for the players by being able to say, now we've closed Act 1. We have now closed Act 2. And now we also understand, okay, we have 2 hours left. It's going to take about 2 hours to do the next act. We have an end goal in mind. We know how long this is going to be, and we know that we have made progress. And all of that is our story structure. We can plan out, if they have this discussion, it's Act 1. They could finish Act 1 immediately. It's done. Okay, cool, we're in Act 2. And it just shows that I've planned for this part of the chapter, this chapter. And it lets you know this is your progress bar for the story. And in a way, it's your own heads-up display to understand where you're going. But I was so hesitant for that because it gave up that old guard control. And it gave up that, like, the story ends when I say it ends. But why would I hold on to that? I would hold on to that because of tradition, because of where the game state came from and where the legacy came from. But now that we're sort of breaking down those walls, how much more elevated and energizing are our tables once we've ripped away and broken down a lot of those things that people have continued to hold on to.
Yeah, and that brings to mind something very important that I think we should acknowledge, which is that what we're touching on here is really how to create a performance in some ways. Like, it is a game, and it's an interactive performance for the players and the DM. It's very rare when you find a play or a movie that somehow interacts with the audience that is watching the movie or play. Deadpool comes to mind. People love Deadpool. He breaks the fourth wall all the time. And that's one of the cool things about it, because that is so hard to do, tastefully, I guess you could say. And not to say that Deadpool is tasteful, but in a way that engages people without ruining the concept of the movie. Because as soon as he breaks the fourth wall, I have a comment on this, and then he continues with the scene, and you are able to re-immerse yourself in that. And I think it really speaks to this idea why it can be so helpful to have training in theater. Because what we're talking about is creating a 3-act structure, just like in plays, just like in movies, because that's what organizes the information that you have to pass in the most efficient manner and the most comprehensive manner, not just like getting it all out there. So I think that's one of the things that really appeals to people when they watch actors play D&D, when they watch even voice actors play D&D, just having that experience of how to deliver a narrative in easy to understand, bite-sized chunks, so to speak, which is the act. And I think that's really cool, because if we as DMs can learn from that without having really gone to formal training or something, then we can expand the way we play, and we can create a professional DM style. And I think that's really exciting, because that's always something that every DM wants. Not every DM, but everyone who's super committed to this game just salivates at the idea of possibly making money while trying to do something they love this much. And there are always going to be like hard days or whatever as a DM, but if you can create the formula, essentially you're deriving a formula for play that is successful without getting repetitive and boring, then I feel you've accomplished something.
Absolutely. And Ian, you kind of briefly mentioned this before, but I figured I would a little bit more concretely slide it in right now. which is one of the things I've come to learn about adjudicating gameplay is skillful execution can make up for a kind of weird or less thought out idea, but the opposite is not true, where if you have an awesome idea but it's not executed very well, it won't be received well. So how many times have we heard movies that are awesome because the actor pulled it off? You know, they weren't given a very good script to work with, but we can at least recognize they made the most of what they had. Street Fighter the movie is like that, where like everyone talks about how awesome Bison's performance was. I can't even remember the actor because he had so much fun. What's up?
Of course.
Yeah. So they talked about how awesome the movie was crap and it wasn't well thought out, but the actor did such a good job. They brought life to the role, you know? And one of the things that my mom was talking to me about yesterday, because we were just talking about D&D and you know, like what they enjoy about it right now and what they look forward to. And she said she always really liked when I DM'd because everything was part of the experience. Even if it was literally rolling on the table, she said that the way I would even go about that was so entertaining to watch that it was never putting a pause on the action, even if it was a structural thing. So, and that's part of it too, is like, it's not losing the momentum. We've talked about that before, but like, even when you're taking a rest, it's not something where you're putting the brakes on and you're taking away from the experience of playing D&D. Just because you're not doing diegetic things in the story doesn't mean you're not playing, you know? And that's what this is. It's a game that you're playing. Just like Adam said with the HUD thing, a lot of times immersion and game structure is thought of as a but or. So to increase immersion, the old guard, like you were saying, Adam, you have to decrease metagaming. And remember, metagaming is thinking of it as a game structure. Like you said too, Adam, I think it's a both and. I think you leverage metagaming. You don't try to fight against people thinking of it as a game structure. Instead, you focus so much on the storytelling and how metagaming will help with storytelling that it heightens the experience. And just before I turn it over to you, I think a lot of times what happens is if you have the focus beyond storytelling, which is of why most people come to D&D. They don't come to it because it's a game system. They come to it because of the storytelling possibilities and the experiential possibilities that it has to offer. You can confirm that. And when you confirm that by allowing players to be creative and stretching the mechanics and being clear that you're stretching the mechanics and being transparent, it's going to encourage them to role play more. And eventually, it's not that you're fighting against metagaming. The downsides of metagaming will eventually become obsolete because it's not serving the core purpose of why we're playing. So it's not a but or, it's a both and, that you're taking the best parts of both things and keeping those while letting the other stuff go, you know?
This all ties back synergistically into what we were talking about when we talk about like having a history structure and having a background. You're creating framing. And by having a proper framing, it allows us an easier time to interact with the world. The other thing that we've addressed before is the separation between player and character. And players that really dive deep into this world will enjoy it from a player looking in on this, interactive movie that's playing out in front of them, but then will also choose how to express themselves as a character. To tie it very briefly back to those riddles, yes, we discovered them and we figured them out as players, but then we chose how to express the answers as a character. So we could make that decision. You can have both, where we can figure it out and then decide, well, is my character really stupid and wouldn't know how to do that? Can I make a cool narrative way that this would play out differently? Or do I sort of mess up the answer because I want to make an interesting story choice? I could totally do that, but it doesn't it doesn't make it so the player has now spoiled everything. You as the player can still enjoy that. And then you can also decide how to express it as a character. we have a lot more that frees us when we understand it to be a game state, but then we can choose how we express ourselves through the game. And that's great. If we have all the information in order to make proper decisions, then we can make cool creative decisions as characters if we understand the mechanics as players.
This was all pre-framing to lay the groundwork for my ultimate thesis here for right now, because I always have an ultimate thesis and then 50 episodes later I discard it. But I think what happens is when we're approaching prep, too many times, and this is going to be a fitness thing, which is, that's new. But too many times DMs think about what they want to get done in a session instead of thinking when they're building in rest and recovery. Because as any fitness person worth anything knows, growth comes from the quality of your recovery, not how much effort you've put in. And they've actually done studies to show that, like, if you do, like, say, like a high intensity workout for like 20 minutes, that is going, and you have proper recovery, which includes proper fuel, like the nutritions that you're taking in and all that kind of stuff, you are going to have exponentially greater results than if you work out for an hour and a half and then you eat crap like McDonald's. It's not how much effort you're putting in, it's how you're building in the rhythm of rest, recovery, and breaks. And that's how you increase the amount of energy at your table. So a lot of times, like, this happened in a game I was playing the other day where the DM wanted us to go to this city, right, that he had really spent time fleshing out. And he thought it was going to take 3 or 4 sessions of us exploring this city. And then he presented us the option. He said, do you want to go to this city or do you want to do a shortcut through the forest? And we're basically like, let's do a shortcut through the forest. And then we had like one little encounter. And he's like, well, that's all I had prepped for today, so I can try to make stuff up now. And it's like, no, this is a good end. Like, we had fun playing the game. It wasn't as long as we had thought it was going to be, but let's stop where you will be able to prep and we will be able to invest an appropriate amount of energy into making this the best experience possible. So to bring it back to what I was talking about with Ian's game, we had basically been doing a lot of RP. We ended right before rolling initiative for a combat, right? And we could have gone through the combat and kind of slogged through it for another hour. Ian had his material ready. But as players, we weren't ready energetically. The best way to leave off on that high and increase anticipation was to cut the session there. Now, sometimes everybody has time and everybody is excited and ready to go. Cutting off the session too early, that's going to leave a weird thing. But, the other thing that what the act structure does, like you were talking about, Adam, I 100% get behind, like, having a very clear metagaming, we are 2/3 through the session. Even if it's not the amount of time that it's not the amount of time you spend playing, it's the quality of the experience you have playing. So it doesn't matter if it's 2 hours or 5 hours, when you prep a session, you think about how much time you have, and you think of a beginning, middle, and end. You think Act 1, Act 2, Act 3. And you prep and steer gameplay towards ending with that built-in rest in mind. But because you have 3 acts, you build in the rest times in between each chunk. So once you're done with Act 1, even if they blow through it in like 20 minutes and you didn't expect that, now you create a little bit of a rest as you prepare for Act 2. If they want to really invest, they're excited about engaging with whatever your Act 1 content is, and it takes 2 hours and you only thought it would take 30 minutes, that's okay, because you're riding that energetic wave that they've invested in you. And then you build in the rest afterward, and then you take a little bit of a break. Now, I'm not saying just because they blow through your Act 1 content, you have to halt gameplay now, but you're thinking in terms of building in rest so that way you're cultivating the energy and closing each loop as it comes up. So, and they've done this with education too. They found that when you're learning something, it's best to learn in 10 to 20-minute chunks with like a minute rest in between, right? And like you said, Adam, as DMs are always teaching, which also means our players are always learning. So think about the best games you've ever had. It's probably at most 10 to 20 minutes of heavy immersion, followed by a joke to close that learning loop, to allow everyone to rest and recover. And then we go back to 10 to 20 minutes of in-depth immersion. You know, we've already built those rests in, and it allows us to collect and organize our thoughts. And I think the key thing is when you close a chapter, like, and by chapter, I mean whatever session you're running, if you're prepping in terms of built-in rests, you'll be able to create a flow of cohesive information that you can close off, which can be easily referenced next time. And one of the things that can happen is if you're running this ongoing, long, epic game and that's just stopping whenever, you know, you're more a slave to time than you are a architect of your session structure. What happens is you can create so many story hooks that we spend more energy organizing the information we should know than we do interacting and actually playing the game. So I would even go so far as to recommend, you know, make sure at the end of your session, you've closed off most of your story hooks that are open, leaving one or two to get them excited for next time. You know, if you leave too many open loops, it's going to produce more of this marathon effect of we're just keep slogging and we're not really resolving a whole lot, or we're not progressing. And it's the information we've learned is going to be less accessible to us because it's not as organized, because it's not fitting into the session structure. So again, the session structure is what's going to, and those built-in rest points are what's going to let you get the most out of your session.
It's interesting because we look at it when a lot of people, like in the history of trying to find time to play, it's just time to play, trying their best to schedule a session. We now exist in time frames where, or at least our sessions seem to be more regular, and more regular in comparison to so many other people out there that would get to play. And we sometimes keep that down to our structures. If you have a satisfying experience, even if you only do it once a month, if it follows that wonderful closing of the loop at the end and has this nice beginning, middle, and end, you've worked in your points of rest, then it's going to be that much more satisfying than 4 weeks of play that doesn't have that. It might feel more like a slog. And it's a great upgrade to your session planning to think of it as an act structure and to work in those points of rest. It also, I think it's less work for you, I would argue, because you know there's a beginning, middle, and end. And hey, if they knock out Acts 1 and 2 in your major structure and it's only been an hour, that's fine. And maybe we close Act 3 and it's only been 2.5 hours, that's fine. If it feels satisfying, you don't have to be a slave to the time frame.
One thing that I do hear as like a potential counterpoint to all of this is going to sound railroady. To which I would counter argue, what's your fear of railroading? Ultimately, a lot of times players are repelled by railroading because they feel it will limit their ability to interact with the game story or the game system, that it somehow removes choices from them. And it's not railroading. There's a beaten path. You can wander off the beaten path. You're allowed to do that, understanding the structural consequences of that. Now we're going to have less time for the main quest. That might be what your group is looking for, and that's okay. But again, as you're actively, you have a beaten path that they can always go back to, but they're not stuck on, they can move off of, Yeah. And that's kind of, I find, the best allegory for the games that I've run that have had the highest rates of success. There is a clear beaten path. There's a dirt road you can travel down if you'd like to. But there's nothing stopping you from jumping off the dirt road for a little bit and kind of exploring some of the off stuff.
My thought had to do with the structures of information and your loops and your open loops. I think, and in this is also sometimes the product of trying to make a large in-depth world, like this big, rich world that has lots of interesting factions, lots of things to go somewhere. But if the interactions that you have, even just minute points of opening loops and closing them, do not close at the end of your session, we will invariably forget about them just by time. We'll just forget about them, or the players will be at a massive disadvantage because, oh yeah, I forgot that happened. Oh man, when did that show up? Oh, that was like 4 sessions ago. Oh boy. And that happens sometimes. And then you have players that take really good notes, and sometimes we have a running log of things and we can use Roll20 for that. But also, you don't want your players to ever feel like, oh man, there's so much information, I'll never keep track of it all. You want them to know just enough to be able to have a decent handle on the things they care about. And if there's an overarching theme, it isn't that, oh, this villain's always been there. It's, here's this instance, here's this other instance. Oh, there seems to be a pattern. Here's this other instance. And then they can see the theme. Think of them like episodes in a TV show. It's, you still at the end of an episode will wrap up a lot of the main points of conflict and contact in the episode, even if there's a main theme for the season. They're still going to wrap up enough out of that little package so you're satiated before the next one, where it might open up some things. Or, 3 episodes back, this NPC that got away, now they come back forward. But even that, we can provide a, remember when that happened? We can always provide better context. We just don't want our details to get lost. And if you don't close up your loops in this more neat package-ish by the end of a session, or get the big ones closed, then it's a lot harder to hold on to that because there's no closure and there's no ending to the first point of that information. Even if we discover more later, you don't know that factoid anymore because it was just stopped in the middle.
So, all right, before I go into this next point to kind of reply to that, just one way to kind of lay the foundation a little. One of the things I've been really meditating on is how to give DMs functional advice that will heighten their skillfulness in the execution of DMing sessions, not coming up with more creative ideas. Because just like I said before, a great execution can save a bad idea. A great idea will not be properly conveyed with a poor execution. So most of this structural stuff is designed to be very functional, concrete, like strategies or tactics that as a DM you can implement in your game no matter what your game is, in order to get the most out of it and have you and your players have the most fun, And I think when it comes to neatly packaging information, one thing to remember about the DM is you get to control which loops open and which loops don't. So I think what can happen with a big story with a lot of factions and a lot of interconnectedness is, as a DM, we get so excited about the sheer possibilities, we allow players to open too many loops too quickly, so that it's hard for them to organize which one to do. So I'm thinking, like Ian's been mentioning in chat, the Skyrim example. You play Skyrim, you wander through a town, and it's like, can you help me with my chickens? And then you go to help with the chickens, and another elf's like, I would like to write a love letter. And then you go to like somewhere else, and it's like, did you hear about the bear in the mountains? And suddenly you're overwhelmed by all of these possibilities. You don't even know where to start, and you start going off on a checklist. And usually, the only difference with Skyrim, first of all, you can go at your own time, and second, it's railroady. I don't care what you say. Skyrim, the open world part, is that you can do things in any order. But once you pick a quest, it's go here, kill the thing, get the thing. Like, it's very, like, each dungeon is literally a path to the thing. Like, there's, like, almost, the only choice you have is, like, your character's race and what abilities you build. But other than that, it's very railroady in its quest design, So when it comes to taking your time, even if you have a fleshed out world with like a dozen factions that all have interconnected relationships, like let your players do one thing at a time, open one loop in the middle of their quest, foreshadow 1, maybe 2 future things that they're going to go on, and then conclude the thing you started before you start the next thing. And you end up with this kind of chain effect where, yes, there's a spider web of things to come up, and in between sessions is where players can ask about it. So you're not taking away from the immersion of doing the thing you're doing. But if a player's like, hey, I was really interested in that like necromancer's lab that we stumbled across in one session. Like, can my character investigate what that's about during our downtime? And it's like, yeah, we've concluded this adventure. We've rested. Everyone knows what happens. And now, because you as a player are interested in this, I'll approach the group. This player is interested in following up on this open loop. Is that something you guys would be interested in doing? Or is that a side project we're going to give just to this character? So instead of having a bunch of one-on-one interactions at the table where everybody is kind of isolated, you can have those one-on-one interactions between sessions through wonderful things like Facebook groups or Discord servers. You can get that out of the way then so that group time is spent with group gameplay, Because why would you do group gameplay with one-on-one interactions? I understand that other people might want to see those one-on-one interactions, so do it in a separate medium, So that way you're not like taking away from group time to do group stuff. You're doing like one-on-one time to do one-on-one stuff. Does that make sense? Like, that came out of nowhere, but the thing that really got me on this thought train, to kind of go back, I really like the sessions I've been running lately. And the reason for that is because I don't run them until I'm prepped. Yeah, so, and like Adam said, these are usually about every 3 weeks, sometimes once a month, sometimes a little more. And it's after I've properly rested and set myself up for the next loop. That's where we run the next session. So it's all about, I'm taking the rest time I need so that I can adjudicate a high level experience, And then because of that, everybody is on the same page, or they at least have access to the same information, so that now the accountability is on my players to get the most that they want out of the game. And the players that end up being like, I didn't know that happened, or it's like, it's because they didn't do their homework. They didn't bring their effort to the table, so they might not get as much out of it, but that's also their decision. That's not on me for hiding anything from them.
And there's also something there that you touched on where we're talking about creating rest and recovery for both the player and the DM. And when you are creating your settings, you could choose to pursue the route that John has taken, but also keep in mind that this is coming after years of trying to keep to that consistent schedule of like once a month, once every 2 weeks, once every week, whatever it is. And that's where I am at now. I like, I've dived so deep into what it means to become a DM that it almost feels like I've been doing this for all my life or something. But in reality, if I think about it, how am I doing my games right now? As a new DM who basically, I always say that I've been doing D&D for like 2 years now, but I haven't really been actually DMing until the start of this pandemic-ish, and in my eyes. And what that means is that right now I'm at a repetition phase in my career as a DM. I am trying to get as much repetition as possible so that I have the experience to rely on when I start moving towards this more loose idea of creating sessions. And because it sounds really awesome to me too, that having that rest, being able to do this whenever, it sounds great. But also there's other things that I have to take into consideration right now. Me personally, I have 3 games going on. I am doing them regularly every 2 weeks. One of the reasons I'm doing it every 2 weeks is actually because this is one of the only ways that me and these groups of people get to interact with each other. And otherwise, we don't see each other on a regular basis. So this is a good way to bring the group together, to get the band back together, And that's one of the reasons that I want to keep doing this every 2 weeks. But when these campaigns come to a close, I will have built up the experience I need as a DM to be able to move more, to transition into this kind of DMing, where I say to my group, I have a campaign I want to run for you guys, but I also want to make sure that it's of the highest quality as well, so that I need to take the time, and it might be less consistent when we meet up. Maybe once a month, maybe every 2 weeks, whatever. And there's nothing wrong with that. I want people who are listening to this that to know that there's nothing wrong with having a session every week, every 2 weeks or something. If that's working for you, that's great. But there's also, you should take into consideration that those weeks where you're feeling that DM burnout because you have 3 sessions to prep for, maybe it's time to postpone it so that you can rest and create a better experience for everyone rather than forcing the issue. And that's important to me, because especially at this time, in the world with the pandemic to consider, it's very easy to find yourself weary and worn out of the things that you're doing, even the things that bring you joy. And that's what we experienced at the beginning of this pandemic, actually, because we were running like 6 games a month or something like that. And it was quite crazy. So, take a page out of our book. If you need the rest, then you should take the rest.
Yeah, and this is a good reminder. I'm glad you said it like that, Ian, that when we mention this stuff, we're excited to share things that have worked really well for us. This is in no way a judgment to how you're running your games. Like, again, even bringing it back to more spontaneous gameplay versus world building, rich mythology gameplay. This is no judgment on anybody else's definition of fun. We're just so excited to share the stuff that's worked and why it's worked, to hopefully add a little bit of value to your game. We're contributing our experience and our information in a way that's going to heighten your ability to share value at your table. And I think, Ian, you touched on something that's like really powerful, which is the wisdom tradition of the martial arts that I study. There is, once you reach 5th degree black belt, you earn the title of master. So you go from being a Mr. whoever or a Mrs. whoever or Miss whoever to a master whoever, right? And my teacher made it explicitly clear that mastery is a process, not a title. So just because you're at a point of mastery at one point in your life doesn't mean that that skill won't atrophy if you don't tend to it. And it also doesn't mean that there's nowhere to improve, Really, that title of mastery means you have demonstrated your commitment to the process of mastery, And that there's a reason why I never talk about mastering a skill, because it's never in the past tense, it's in the present tense. And it's really interesting that, we call it a dungeon master, that's the name of the individual who has not only taken on the privileges, but the responsibility of adjudicating and delivering a kind of experience for their table. And that a lot of times dungeon masters will get stuck in I don't want to call them mechanics. I'm not finding a better word for it. They'll get stuck in making sure that they do an investigation check instead of a perception check, because that's what the book said. And a lot of times they'll get stuck in the right way or the true way the game should be played, instead of awakening themselves to their own process of development and the process of their table. One thing that I will still defend was my decision to run my early games with rules as written, because my table needed time to mature as gamers to be able to not only appreciate, but make full skillful value of any homebrew that I introduced. That it's not about me being right and knowing what's best for them. It's about being patient to their development and where they're at. And then when it's appropriate, introducing an additional nuanced element that's going to, again, enrich the experiences that we share together. And I think that you're right, Ian, that I think, for lack of a better term, the difference between, say, a amateur DM, an expert DM, and a masterful DM, and notice it's not like a master DM, masterful, the process of mastery, is that an amateur DM is worried about them, So they're worried about like Adam was saying, I hope my monster runs right. I hope I follow the game rules like I'm supposed to. I hope everybody has fun because I'd feel really bad if they didn't. That's like the amateur level. The expert level is when you can relinquish that fear for the service of your table, where it becomes about them. So it's you're doing this because you want them to enjoy the game, because you enjoy it when they enjoy it, as opposed to a fear-based response of, I don't want to feel bad that they didn't enjoy it. And you can hear the shift in the language. One of them is more additive than it is defensive. And then masterful DMing is where you've put in the experience enough that it becomes second nature and it just happens. So you're not sitting there, and this can be reflective, like after the fact, like, wow, this has been going really well. Why has this been going so well? And what's different between, it seems like such a little change, but what is that little change that made this game so much better than that game? Or you're comparing styles or skill sets and that stuff, and you're like, they followed all the right tips and they followed everything, but it still didn't work out right. Why was that? And it becomes this like unconscious consciousness where in the middle of running a session, you are awake and you're recognizing things, but you may not even recognize that you're recognizing them. Some of the best martial artists I've seen, when they're demonstrating their craft, it always looks like they're doing the technique a little bit differently and they don't even know it, because they're just so trained to adapt to little changes in how their opponent or partner or whoever is changing. It just happens, And I think that's the key thing. And you're never tenured to any of them. I've met DMs that, again, I've talked to them on the internet, on everything. They've been DMing for 20 years. They've lost themselves in the amateur mindset, of justifying why what they do is good and why you have no right to tell them how to change anything. I've met DMs that have DM'd for 2 months and they start hitting that expert masterful tier, but we can always slip down and we can always rise up. Part of our game of development is just paying attention to the signs and signals, testing new things, and then realizing we have that room to grow by resting and recovering. Before I turn it over to Adam, quick personal anecdote. I ran games at the expert level pretty much for a few years. When we went to Roll20, I dropped down to the amateur level when we did Mad Mage. I was trying something new, which meant my skill level went down. On the other side of it, I feel like I'm getting passed back to the other side of the expert level, So just because you lose your confidence, it's not about if you're confident or not, it's how you replenish your confidence when you're faced with humility and humbleness. So, and that's a powerful resiliency skill that I think we excuse ourselves and others too many times. We excuse the behavior so that we don't have to face the discomfort of growing. Whereas rather we're paying attention to, yeah, that sucked. That hurt, didn't it? How are we going to replenish, recover, rest, and be better on the other side of it?
Now, looking at this from a perspective, the main thought that occurs here is actually time, the amount of time that we have. And when we think about long-running campaigns, let's present it from here. For the period of at least the last 2 to 3 years, let's say 4, really, Gray Owls began when we had another professional space to be in. And then it shifted to renting out the dojo. And then it shifted to Roll20. And during that whole evolution, a lot of things were changing in our own lives and in the business practices. And all the while through that, from the beginning of that other business that we were working in, and then to now, I have been a professional dungeon master, professional game master. I've run a lot of games, and all of it, we discussed before the whole aspect of putting butts in seats and how that philosophy has now shifted in my brain and how much more freeing it is. The other thing that sort of occurs to me like a ton of bricks is because everything was structured down to like an hourly wage, it was always about the time. that my consistency of running 6-8 campaigns a week, not just a month, a week, would breed certain professional qualities and certain other professional detriments of always feeling like I had to be on, always on, fill 2 hours, always fill 2 hours to the end, always end on a cliffhanger, always have a combat prepared for night owls every single time. And those things created wonderful, consistent, I had to upgrade immediately. And that creates something very powerful because it's almost like you go through those growing pains and then you're at a really good level and you stay pretty consistent. Even at your lowest area, you're still pretty good and you'll be able to provide a strong experience. And yet I still had sessions that were rough. But the main thing is, what if we didn't think about it in terms of time down to the minute? If I have a pretty decent idea that this will take about 2.5 hours, but has the capacity to fill 3, and if it ends at 2.5, have I still provided the correct experience and the correct amount of experience, the satisfying experience that's worth, quote unquote, 3 hours of time? And when we look at it from a business perspective, a lot of it came down to time, hourly time, when really at this point, would it not be upgradable to the quality of the experience? That is worth the theoretical time. And in thinking about it like that, it becomes less and less about filling the time and more about creating a structured episodic experience that has closure and has a beginning, middle, and end and has points of rest. And that might take 4 hours or it might take 2. And being okay with either outcome and the striations between, because you're not worried about putting butts in seats for a certain amount of time. You're instead focusing on the quality of the experience. And in so doing this, at this point in time, I've closed a 2-year campaign and a 3-year Gray Owls campaign. And I'm taking a break. And it's not just a month break or a few weeks break. I'm still taking a break. And in taking that space, I've never had the luxury of doing that. I say never over the last 4 years because it was a business and it was my job. It was to pay the bills. And now it's a more privatized thing that is just something cool I can do that still works from a slight business model, but it's a very casual thing. And it doesn't have to have that intensity to it. And in removing that structure and taking a break and allowing myself to rest, I miss running games monthly with the Night Owls, and I miss running Gray Owls. And lore-wise and prep-wise, I'm not quite ready to start back up. And that's okay. So when we talk about taking your rest and making sure you only play when really you're prepared to do so, there is great value in that, because the experiences you're going to give and receive are going to be that much more satisfying and beautiful and powerful if you've taken enough time to rest. And that is tremendous. And what a great lesson to learn now, especially in COVID land. We absolutely need to embrace our points of rest. And for my players that are just chomping at the bit, I want to play now, it would be a disservice to you to jump in now. But just a little bit more of wait time, a little more patience on this end is going to provide such a stronger experience moving forward. And that's such a hard thing for me to recognize as a business person, as a professional dungeon master. Sometimes people pay me for this stuff. It's just hard to recognize that I really do need to prep it, and I need to make sure I'm 100% comfortable before I start, because if I don't do that, it will provide an experience that is less than what my standard is. And then I won't be happy with it, and I don't think it'll be the best experience.
Yeah, so just two little things, then we'll wrap up here. First, isn't it just so funny how our like big thing has always been rest, like just called rest, respect, empathy, but even together, that's like the fifth thing is rest. And Adam, you mentioned that feeling of like that you miss it. I went through that too, and it's almost like you're putting it away for now. That missing it is the same exact feeling that will lead to the anticipation that will energize your sessions when you pick it back up. You will be amazed at how well everything comes together because you've given yourself that time. And just to speak personally again, we haven't podcasted for like 2 weeks. Think about how awesome this was. So yeah, you guys, this was a privilege.
So thank you, everybody, for tuning in to today's episode of the DM Shower Thoughts. You can find this podcast up on Podbean every Friday at noon. And if you want the episodes earlier, you should go check out our Patreon. If you want to support the show, go check out our Patreon at DM Shower Thoughts. You can go find us, and there'll be links in the descriptions down below as well. And then we have my blog, The GM's Corner, with features by Ian and by John over at AdamsDrakeProductions.com. Go find us on Facebook, DM Shower Thoughts, YouTube, DM Shower Thoughts, and on Twitter now, DM Shower Thoughts. Have a wonderful day, everybody, and please, game responsibly. Bye-bye now.
I strive to defend Nuisa Talos and live up to my role as a spiritual leader.
I journey to increase my knowledge of the cusp and cosmos. It has been prophesied that there is destiny in my blood.
I fight for the honor of the name Steadyhand and the great kingdom of Earth.
I wander to find my true place in the world. I will protect my home and family at all costs.
A young ruler's grasp for power threatens an already fractured world. Meet the heroes in Arc 2 of Advantage, a 5th edition D&D audio drama. Find us on all podcast apps.